The air in the Vance Corporation tower was a lie. It tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing, and held the temperature of a machine's equilibrium. It was filtered, recycled, and perfected, a sterile medium for the seamless flow of data and the quiet hum of productivity. Elian moved through it like a ghost, his presence calibrated to be just as neutral. His grey uniform blended with the matte finish walls, his footsteps were silent on the sound-dampening floors, and his scent was a carefully constructed void. He was Unit 734 in data assimilation, a designation as colourless as the world he inhabited. For 9 years, this neutrality had been his sanctuary, a fortress built of regimen and chemical denial. Every morning at 06 Gaozhou, he swallowed a small white pill. The suppressant was a marvel of Vance pharmacology, the cornerstone of the ordered society Kalen Vance's father had engineered. It did not just mask, it erased. It scrubbed the biological signature of Omega from his cells, leaving behind a placid, manageable blankness. He was not an Omega. He was an employee. He was not a creature of instinct. He was a functionary of the system. This was the covenant he had made with himself, the price of a quiet life. But today, the lie was unraveling. It began not as a feeling, but as a flicker in the periphery of his senses, a system error in the code of his own body. A warmth bloomed low in his belly, a soft, insidious heat that had no place in the climate-controlled tower. He pressed a hand to his stomach, the fabric of his uniform suddenly coarse against his skin. The numbers on his terminal blurred, the crisp lines of code wavering like a heat haze on asphalt. He checked the chronometer on his screen. 14:42. His next dose was not for another 15 hours and 18 minutes. Impossible. He had never missed a dose. His life was a testament to precision, to the meticulous avoidance of biological chaos. The warmth spread, coiling in his limbs, making the synthetic air feel thick and suffocating. A scent, faint but undeniable, pricked at his awareness. It was not the ozone of the servers or the antiseptic cleaner used by the maintenance drones. It was sweet. It was his. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the building fever. He had to get out. He had to get home, to the sterile isolation of his apartment, to the emergency kit in his medical cabinet. He could double the dose, flood his system, force the error back into submission. He stood, his chair rolling back with a soft, jarring sound that felt like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence of the assimilation floor. A few heads turned, their expressions placidly curious. Anomaly detected. Elian ignored them, his focus narrowing to a single objective, the elevator bank at the far end of the hall. Each step was a battle against the traitorous warmth seeping into his blood. The polished floor seemed to stretch into an infinite, gleaming expanse. His skin felt too tight, a strange humidity prickling at his hairline. The scent was stronger now, a delicate, desperate perfume of rain-soaked earth and something akin to blooming nightshade, sweet and vaguely poisonous. It clung to him, a shroud he could not cast off. He was a walking contagion in a sterile ward. He reached the elevator bank, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He jabbed the call button, the lit icon, a malevolent eye staring back at him. He needed the local lift, the slow, multi-stop descent to the ground floor, but the universe, in its sudden, cruel irony, offered him the executive express. A soft chime announced its arrival, the brushed steel doors sliding open with a whisper. He didn't hesitate. Speed was all that mattered. He stepped inside, the doors sighing shut behind him, encasing him in a mirrored cage. And then he saw he was not alone. Leaning against the far wall, bathed in the cool, recessed lighting, was Kalen Vance, the CEO, the architect of this world, the final authority on the order Elian's entire life was built upon. He was taller than his public broadcasts suggested, his presence filling the small space not with overt power, but with an unnerving stillness, a gravitational pull that bent the very air around him. His suit was the color of a stormy sky, impeccably tailored, a severe frame for a man who was all sharp angles and chilling composure. His eyes, the color of ice, met Elian's in the reflection of the polished steel wall. There was no recognition in them, no sign that he saw anything more than a low-level employee in the wrong elevator. But Elian saw everything. He saw the man whose name was on the pill he took every morning, the man whose corporation had defined the parameters of his existence. The heat in his gut clenched into a knot of pure terror. Of all the people, in all the places. The elevator began its silent, frictionless descent. 60 floors to the ground, a lifetime. The scent, his scent, was now a palpable force in the confined space, a living thing twisting in the air between them. He could smell it. He knew Vance could smell it. An alpha of his caliber could probably taste it on the back of his tongue. Elian squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the reaction, disgust, anger, the cold command to have him removed and sanitized. He waited for the lurch of the emergency stop, for the quiet summons of corporate security. He waited for the end of his meticulously constructed life. But Kalen Vance did not move. He did not press the stop button. He simply watched, his gaze unwavering, his expression a mask of calm, calculating neutrality. And in that silence, as the elevator fell through the heart of the tower, Elian's heat, for the first time in 9 years, truly began. The silence in the elevator was not empty. It was a dense, pressurized medium, thick with the scent of Elian's undoing and the weight of Kalen Vance's stillness. The air, once a sterile promise of control, was now saturated with the sweet, frantic perfume of an Omega in distress. It was the scent of panic and burgeoning need, of rain and soil and a deep cellular alarm. Elian pressed himself into the corner, his back flush against the cool metal, as if he could merge with it, become invisible. But there was no hiding from this. His body was a beacon, broadcasting a signal he had spent his entire adult life jamming. The heat was no longer a gentle warmth. It was a liquid fire pouring through his veins, making his skin ache, and his thoughts dissolve into a feverish haze. He could feel the slickness gathering on his skin, the tremor in his hands. Every nerve ending was alight, screaming for a release he could not comprehend and did not want. He dared a glance at the mirrored wall, at the reflection of the man who stood sentinel in his personal apocalypse. Kalen Vance had not moved a single inch. His posture was relaxed, yet imbued with an absolute predatory stillness. His eyes were fixed on Elian's reflection, his focus so intense it was almost a physical touch. There was no visible sign of arousal, no bestial aggression Elian had been taught to expect from an alpha confronted with an unmated, unsuppressed Omega. There was only a profound, unnerving curiosity, the look of a scientist observing a reaction that defied all known variables. It was worse than disgust. It was analysis. He was not a person in crisis. He was a data point. He was a flaw in the system. The flaws chimed past, each soft, electronic tone marking another second of his exposure. 52. 51. The scent in the air was changing. deepening. The sweet edge of panic was being overtaken by something muskier, a richer, more complex note of invitation that horrified him. His own biology was betraying him, weaving a lure for the predator in the cage with him. His mind screamed at his body to stop, to cease this humiliating, involuntary surrender. He wrapped his arms around himself, a futile gesture of defense. He could smell the alpha now, too. It wasn't the overpowering scent of dominance he had anticipated. It was subtle, cold, and clean, like the air after a lightning strike or the smell of wet slate, ozone, and winter. It did not seek to overwhelm his senses, but to cut through them, a sharp, sterile counterpoint to his own organic chaos. It was the scent of absolute control. The elevator slowed, its descent becoming a gentle glide. 40. The executive transfer floor. The doors would open. Someone would get on. They would see. They would smell. The shame was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest. But the doors remained closed. The elevator continued its express journey downward. Vance had keyed it for a direct descent. For him. For them. The realization struck Elian with the force of a blow. This was not an accident. This was a capture. He finally broke the silence, his voice a ragged whisper, unrecognizable to his own ears. Please. He didn't know what he was asking for. For help? For release? For the man to press the stop button and end this suffocating proximity? Kalen's gaze shifted from the mirror to meet Elian's directly. His eyes were not cruel. They were something far more terrifying. They were devoid of judgment. Breathe, Unit 734, he said, his voice a low, calm baritone that vibrated through the charged air. He used Elian's designation, a deliberate, chilling reminder of his place in the corporate machine. A reminder that even in this moment of profound biological upheaval, he was still just a component that was malfunctioning spectacularly. The use of his number, the coldness of the command, should have anchored him in his terror. Instead, it did something worse. It shattered the last of his resistance. A sob, hot and ragged, tore from his throat. The heat crested, a wave of dizzying intensity that buckled his knees. His legs gave out, and he slid down the wall, his body curling into a tight, defensive ball on the floor. The world dissolved into a blur of polished steel, blinding light, and the overwhelming, dual sense of his own frantic bloom and the alpha's chilling calm. Through the roaring in his ears, he heard the final, soft chime as the elevator reached the ground floor. The doors slid open, not to the public lobby, but to the hushed, concrete silence of a private sub-level garage. A sleek black vehicle, its engine humming almost silently, waited just beyond the threshold. Kalen Vance moved at last. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over Elian. He did not reach for him. He simply stood there, a tall, dark silhouette against the sterile light of the garage. The system has failed, he stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple, undeniable fact. A new variable requires analysis. Then, with an economy of motion that was both graceful and terrifyingly efficient, he bent down, and the world went dark. He awoke to the scent of clean linen and the soft, ambient glow of a room without windows. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was in a medical bay, the logical destination for a malfunctioning unit. But the bed was too soft, the sheets a thread count far beyond corporate issue. The air, like in the tower, was filtered and neutral, but here it carried a faint, lingering trace of ozone and winter. Kalen Vance's scent. It was woven into the fabric of the place. Elian sat up, his body ached with a deep, unfamiliar thrum. The heat was still there, a constant simmering fire beneath his skin, but the sharp, frantic edge of panic had been blunted by exhaustion. He was wearing a simple, soft cotton tunic and trousers, not his own clothes. The room was vast and minimalist, a study in shades of grey and white, a single piece of art, a chaotic splash of black ink on a white canvas hung on one wall, a stark contrast to the room's severe order. There was no door handle, only a seamless panel next to the frame. A cage, a luxurious, beautifully appointed cage. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet sinking into a plush, dark carpet. A tray of food sat on a low table, a protein broth, a piece of fruit, a glass of water with condensation beading on its side. It was sustenance, clinically presented. Sustenance for the specimen. He was the anomaly, the new variable, and this was his observation chamber. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through the simmering heat. A panel on the wall slid open with a faint hiss, and Kalen Vance stepped into the room. He was dressed as impeccably as he had been in the elevator, his presence an immediate imposition of order on the space. He held a small data slate in one hand. He did not approach the bed, but stopped near the center of the room, maintaining a careful distance. "Your core temperature is 38.9 degrees Celsius, he said, his voice as calm and measured as if he were reading a quarterly report. "Your pheromone output is registering at levels previously considered theoretical. The suppressant appears to have had a paradoxical effect. Instead of degradation, your system has developed a complete and catastrophic immunity." He spoke of Elian's body as if it were a faulty piece of equipment. Elian stared at him, his mind struggling to connect the clinical words with the fire raging inside him. "Where am I?" he managed to ask, his throat dry. "My private residence. The top floor of the tower," Vance replied without inflection. "It is the most secure, environmentally controlled location available. Secure. Controlled." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they were the vocabulary of a prison. "I need my medication," Elian said, the words a desperate lie. He didn't know if more suppressants would help or kill him, but it was the only script he knew. Vance looked up from his slate, his icy gaze meeting Elian's. For the first time, a flicker of something other than analysis entered his expression. It might have been pity, or perhaps just profound, intellectual disappointment. "Your medication is the reason you are here," he said. "Administering more would be unpredictable. The experiment must be allowed to run its course." Experiment. The word hung in the sterile air, cold and sharp. He was not an asset. He was not an employee. He was an experiment. A wave of dizziness washed over Elian, the reality of his situation crashing down. He was trapped at the mercy of the one man who embodied the system he had dedicated his life to appeasing. And that man saw him as nothing more than a biological curiosity. The heat inside him flared, no longer just a physical sensation, but a raw, desperate rage. His body might be betraying him, but he would not be a passive subject in Kalen Vance's study. He would not. The hours bled into one another, a seamless, disorienting flow of time in the windowless room. The heat was a tide, ebbing and flowing, each crest higher and more powerful than the last. During the lulls, there was a strange, feverish clarity. During the peaks, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of sensation. His own scent was a constant, cloying presence, a thick, sweet fog that filled the apartment. It was a language he had never been allowed to learn, and now it was screaming from his pores. He was dimly aware of Kalen Vance's comings and goings. The Alpha was a silent, recurring fixture in his delirium. He would enter, place a fresh tray of food or a pitcher of cool water on the table, and then retreat to a chair in the corner of the room, observing, always observing. He never spoke unless Elian spoke first, and his answers were always precise, clinical, and maddeningly detached. Elian tried to fight it. He tried to cling to the rational, ordered mind that had been his shield for so long. He would count the threads in the sheets, recite data assimilation protocols, list the prime numbers in descending order. But the heat was a solvent, dissolving logic, leaving only raw, primal instinct in its wake. His body craved things his mind recoiled from: softness, warmth, a nest. The impulse was so powerful it was a physical ache. In a moment of desperate surrender, he stripped the bed, dragging the soft duvet and pillows into the corner of the room, burrowing into them, creating a small, dark space where he could hide. It was the most humiliating act of his life, a complete capitulation to the biology he despised. From his corner, Vance watched the entire process, his expression unreadable. He made a note on his data slate. Elian wanted to scream at him, to throw something, to shatter that infuriating calm. But he had no strength. The nest offered a sliver of comfort, a fragile sense of security in the wreckage of his self-control. And then came the memories. The heat did not just unlock his body, it unlocked his mind, pulling forth ghosts he had buried under 9 years of chemical silence. He was 15 again, in the sterile white halls of the State Designation Center. The air there had been thick with the scent of frightened adolescence and the sharp, antiseptic smell of officialdom. He remembered the test, the small pinprick on his finger, the machine that analyzed his blood and spat out a single damning word on a small card: Omega. He remembered his father's face, not angry, but disappointed, the way one might look at a promising investment that had failed to mature. He remembered the silence in the car on the way home, a silence that was louder than any condemnation. He was a complication, a genetic liability in a family that prized beta neutrality and quiet ambition. He was a risk to their carefully maintained social standing. The solution was immediate and absolute: the Vance Corporation Suppressant Program. "It's for the best," his mother had said, her hand not quite touching his shoulder. "It will allow you to have a normal life, a productive life." Normal. Productive. He had clung to those words. He had embraced the chemical erasure of his self, grateful for the chance to be invisible, to be useful, to be grey. He was not a son. He was a problem to be managed. He remembered his first heat, the one that had broken through a lower-grade suppressant a year later. It had happened at the academy. The shame, the fear, the way the other students had looked at him, their faces a mixture of pity, curiosity, and disgust. The way an alpha instructor had cornered him in the library, his scent thick with a predatory hunger that had made Elian's stomach turn. He had been rescued by the academy proctors, sedated, and sent home with a note recommending a higher dosage. That was the trauma he had buried. Not just the fear of the alpha, but the profound, gut-wrenching shame of his own body's response. The small, treacherous part of him that had felt a flicker of instinctual welcome even as his mind screamed in terror. He had sworn then that it would never happen again. He would be stronger than his biology. He would be a fortress of will and pharmaceuticals. And for 9 years he had been. now curled in a makeshift nest in the penthouse of the man whose family had built both the poison and the cure. That fortress had crumbled to dust. He was 15 again, helpless and exposed, his body singing a song he refused to recognize as his own. He let out a low, wounded sound, a keen of grief for the self he had so carefully constructed. In the corner, Kalen Vance lowered his data slate. The soft click of the device settling on the table cut through the quiet room. For the first time, he did not look like a scientist. He looked like a man listening to something he did not understand, but was beginning, terrifyingly, to feel. Kalen Vance stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, one level below the private residence where the Omega was currently housed. The city sprawled beneath him, a vast, glittering circuit board of perfect order. From this vantage point, there was no chaos, no unpredictability. There were only patterns, the rhythmic flow of transport vehicles along illuminated pathways, the precise grid of residential and commercial sectors, the steady, pulsing light of the Vance Tower at the city's heart, a beacon of absolute control. This was his inheritance. His father, Marcus Vance, had not built a corporation. He had built an ideology of biological harmony through chemical regulation. He had seen the passions, the rivalries, the destructive cycles of alphas and omegas as a fundamental flaw in the human design, a chaotic variable that needed to be solved. And he had solved it. The Vance suppressants were his life's work, the master algorithm that had brought society into a state of placid, predictable equilibrium. Kalen had not merely inherited the company. He had inherited the conviction. He had spent his life refining the system, optimizing the protocols, ensuring the seamless function of his father's vision. He believed in order. He believed in control. He believed that human nature, in its rawest form, was a liability. And then Unit 734 had stepped into his elevator. The Omega, Elian, his file stated, a name that felt too soft, too organic for the sterile lines of a personnel record, was a walking paradox. He was the single greatest failure of the Vance system, and yet he was also its most profound product. 9 years of rigorous adherence to the protocol. A perfect record of compliance. His file was a testament to the system's success, a portrait of a volatile biological designation rendered inert and productive, until it wasn't. The scent in that elevator had been a declaration of war against everything Kalen stood for. It was the scent of chaos, of nature rebelling against the cage of science. But it was not just the scent. It was the Omega himself. In the grip of a full, catastrophic heat, surrounded by the scent of a dominant alpha, trapped in a steel box, he had not surrendered. He had fought. Kalen had seen the terror in his eyes, but beneath it, there was a core of furious defiance. He had met Kalen's gaze in the mirror, not with submission, but with a silent, desperate plea that was also an accusation. It was illogical. It was fascinating. Kalen had spent the last 36 hours observing him, cataloguing every fluctuation in temperature, every spike in pheromonal output, every muttered word in his fevered sleep. He approached it as he would any other problem, with data, analysis, and emotional detachment. He was a variable, an anomaly, an experiment, but the detachment was fraying at the edges. The scent from the residence level seeped down, even through the sophisticated ventilation system, a faint, sweet ghost in the air of his pristine office. It was a distraction, an unwelcome input that interfered with his processing. More than that, it was the sounds, the low whimpers of pain, the soft, rustling sounds of the nest building, an act of such pure, unadulterated instinct, it felt like a religious rite. And the words, whispered to ghosts in the room, father, normal, productive. He had pulled Elian's full medical history, cross-referencing it with his father's private research logs, archives that were sealed even from the corporation's board. And there he had found it, a series of encrypted files from the final years of Marcus Vance's life. The project was codenamed Janus. His father, the great champion of biological suppression, had been secretly working on its opposite. He had become obsessed with a theoretical genetic variant, a recessive omega gene that, under prolonged exposure to suppressants, would not weaken, but adapt. It would learn the chemical structure of the suppressant and, when triggered, develop not just an immunity, but a rebound cascade. A heat of unprecedented, potentially dangerous intensity. His father had believed this variant was the key to a new phase of control, a way to isolate and weaponize the most potent Omega biology. He had been searching for a subject. He had died before he could find one. Kalen stared at the screen, at the genetic markers highlighted in his father's research, and then at the live bio feed from Elian's room. They were a perfect match. Elian was not just an accident. He was the culmination of his father's secret obsession. He was not an experiment Kalen had started. He was one he had inherited. The realization settled in his chest, cold and heavy. His father had not been trying to erase biology. He had been trying to refine it, to breed a more perfect subject for his control. The system wasn't designed just to pacify. It was designed to hunt. The knowledge recontextualized everything. Elian, huddled in his nest one floor above, was not a malfunctioning unit. He was the intended result, a feature, not a bug, a problem his father had engineered, leaving him to solve it. A chilling sense of irony washed over Kalen. His entire life had been dedicated to maintaining a system of perfect order, only to discover its foundation was a lie, a grand, secret experiment in eugenics. He looked back at the city, at the millions of lives moving in perfect, predictable patterns, all of them governed by a chemical lie he helped perpetuate. The clean, sterile lines of the metropolis suddenly seemed like the bars of a vast planetary cage. His control was an illusion, a script written by a dead man. And Elian was the one, unplanned variable, who could bring the entire production crashing down. A low sound echoed from the speaker that carried the audio feed from the residence. It was a sound of profound grief, a tearing, wounded noise that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with a shattered soul. Kalen felt an unwelcome, illogical echo of it in his own chest. A system error. He was the controller, the observer. He did not feel. But the sound vibrated through him, a resonant frequency that threatened to shake his own carefully constructed foundations. The experiment had to run its course, he had told Elian, but he was no longer certain who or what was truly being tested. Elian drifted in a fog of fever and fragmented memories. The world had shrunk to the confines of the nest he had built, a small sanctuary of softness against the hard, sterile lines of the room. Time was a loop of burning heat, aching loneliness, and the chilling, intermittent presence of Kalen Vance. He had lost track of the days. There was only the cycle, the rising tide of instinct, the brief respite of exhaustion, the ghosts of his past whispering in his ears. He was weak, his body pliant with a need that felt alien and yet terrifyingly intimate. But his mind, in the quiet moments between the waves, was sharpening. The constant, low-grade terror was coalescing into a cold, hard knot of anger. He was not a malfunctioning machine. He was not a lab rat. He was a person, and his life had been stolen from him, first by his family's shame, and now by this corporation's cold curiosity. During one of his lucid periods, a desperate, reckless energy propelled him from the nest. Vance was absent, likely in his office below, observing from a distance. The apartment was silent, save for the low hum of the air filtration. He needed to find a way out, not just from the room, but from this entire situation. He searched the living area, his movements clumsy, his body still heavy with fever. The space was as impersonal as a luxury hotel suite that had never been occupied. There were no books, no photographs, no personal effects, only the stark furniture, the single piece of abstract art, and a large, dark screen that dominated one wall. It looked like a media center, but as he approached, it flickered to life, displaying a complex biotelemetry feed. His biotelemetry, his heart rate, core temperature, respiratory cycle, pheromone output, all displayed in crisp, glowing lines and numbers. He was a specimen under glass, his every biological function monitored and recorded. A wave of nausea and violation washed over him. He wanted to smash the screen, to erase the data of his own humiliation. His gaze fell upon a small, secondary window open in the corner of the display. It was a text file, partially obscured, a research log. Driven by a furious, self-destructive curiosity, he touched the screen, expanding the window. The text was dense, clinical. It was filled with terminology he didn't understand, but the subject was clear. Project Janus. He scanned the document, his eyes catching on phrases that made the blood freeze in his veins. Recessive genetic variant, prolonged suppressant exposure, adaptive immunity, rebound cascade. It was a blueprint for his own personal hell. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a failure of the medication. This was a design. He scrolled faster, his trembling finger smearing the screen. He found a list of potential candidates, a series of anonymous designation numbers identified for monitoring, and near the bottom, a new entry, dated only a few weeks ago, Unit 734, his number, followed by a single chilling annotation. Subject acquired. He was not an asset. He was a subject. He was not an employee who had fallen ill. He was a resource that had been harvested. The words echoed in his mind, a mantra of horrifying clarification. The life he had built, the neutrality he had prized, it was all a lie. He had not been hiding from the system. He had been cultivated by it. He was a plant in a greenhouse, carefully tended until the day he produced the desired, monstrous bloom. He stumbled back from the screen, a strangled cry catching in his throat. He saw it all now. Kalen Vance's calm curiosity, his lack of surprise, his maddeningly detached observation. He had known. From the moment Elian had stepped into that elevator, reeking of his own biological failure, Vance had known exactly what was happening. He wasn't studying a new variable. He was confirming a hypothesis. The rage that had been simmering inside him erupted, a clean, pure flame that burned away the feverish haze. The heat in his body was no longer a source of shame. It was a weapon. It was the evidence of their crime. It was the one thing that was truly his, an uncontrollable force in their world of perfect control. He heard the hiss of the panel to the bedroom sliding open. Kalen Vance stepped into the room, his gaze immediately falling on Elian standing before the screen on the exposed research file. For a fraction of a second, the Alpha's mask of composure slipped. It was not surprise Elian saw, but something else. Resignation. The observer had been observed. The secret was out. Experiment, Elian breathed, the word ablaze in the quiet air. That's what you called it. He turned to face Vance, his body still trembling, but his eyes blazing with a defiant fire the Alpha had never seen before. You knew, he said, his voice low and shaking with fury. This wasn't a failure. This was a success. The heat chose that moment to crest, a towering, unstoppable wave of pure instinct. It crashed over him, a force of nature unleashed. But this time it was different. It was not just a biological imperative. It was amplified by his rage, fueled by his sense of betrayal. The scent that poured from him was no longer just sweet and inviting. It was charged with anger, a defiant challenge. It was the scent of a storm breaking. Kalen Vance stood his ground, but Elian saw the subtle shift in his posture, the slight tensing of his shoulders. The air between them crackled, a tangible thing, thick with pheromones and unspoken accusations. The Alpha's cold, sterile scent of ozone intensified, a defensive perimeter against the onslaught of Elian's raw, emotional broadcast. This was no longer an observation. It was a confrontation. The project was not mine, Kalen said, his voice tight, strained. It was my father's. And you are its loyal son, Elian shot back, taking a shaky step forward. His body screamed for submission, for the comfort of a dominant presence. But his mind, his will, refused. He would not be broken. He would not be a footnote in some dead man's research log. You locked me in here. You watched me. You recorded me. You are just as guilty. He was closing the distance between them, each step an act of supreme effort. The proximity was dizzying. The blend of their sense was an intoxicating, terrifying symphony. He could feel the power rolling off the Alpha in waves, a silent command to kneel, to submit, to be still. But he could also feel something else, something new, a flicker of uncertainty in the man's glacial composure. What did you think would happen? Elian demanded, his voice rising. Did you think I would just perform? That I would break down quietly for your data slate? Did you think I had no memory, no will, no self beyond what your chemicals allowed me to have? He was close now, only a few feet away. He could see the faint lines of tension around Kalen's eyes, the subtle flare of his nostrils as he took in Elian's scent. He was affected. The perfect machine was experiencing an error, a connection, strange and unwanted, sparked between them. It was not desire. It was something deeper, more invasive, a raw, empathic link forged in the crucible of Elian's heightened state. He felt a sudden, jarring echo of the Alpha's inner world, a crushing weight of legacy, a lifetime of rigid control, a profound, sterile loneliness, and beneath it all, a flicker of something that looked almost like envy. Envy for the raw, chaotic, undeniable life pouring out of Elian. The insight was so shocking, it made him falter. Kalen's control wasn't just a philosophy. It was a prison, and he was its warden and its sole inmate. The realization did not soften his anger, but it changed its shape. His enemy was not a monster. He was a man trapped in a cage of his own making. You feel it, don't you? Elian whispered, the words a raw accusation. You feel what this is, not just in the air, not just the scent. You feel me. He saw a flicker in Kalen's icy eyes, a brief, unguarded glimpse of the man behind the CEO. It was a look of profound shock, as if Elian had just read the source code of his soul. The empathic link, born of Elian's extreme biological state, was a two-way street, a psychic intrusion. Kalen was not just observing the experiment anymore, he was becoming part of it. The perfect, detached scientist was being contaminated by his subject. The moment stretched, taut, and vibrating with unspoken energy. The heat was a roaring furnace inside Ilian, demanding completion, demanding surrender. But his spirit, newly forged in the fire of betrayal, refused to bow. He held Kalen's gaze, his own eyes burning with fever and defiance. He was laid bare, his body a spectacle of biological need, but he had never felt more powerful. He had found the crack in Kalen Vance's armor. He was the chaos that the system of order could not compute. He was the ghost in the machine, and he would not be deleted. He would not be contained. The scent of storm and ozone warred in the silent room. A battle of wills played out on a purely chemical and psychic level. And for the first time, Elian believed it was a battle he could win. Kalen felt the intrusion as a physical breach. It was as if the Omega's consciousness, amplified by the storm of his heat, had bypassed all his mental firewalls and plugged directly into his own. He was feeling things that were not his, a phantom ache of shame from a sunlit academy library, a suffocating sense of familial disappointment in a silent car, the cold, metallic taste of a suppressant on the tongue every morning for 9 years. He was experiencing Elian's memories, Elian's trauma, as if they were his own. The carefully constructed walls of his detachment, built over a lifetime of disciplined control, were being dismantled, brick by painful brick. He was the observer, the analyst. His role was to be separate, to remain objective. But objectivity was impossible when you could feel the subject's agony resonating in your own bones. He watched Elian, who stood before him like a judgment, trembling with the force of his own biology, but with a gaze as steady and sharp as broken glass. The Omega's scent was a physical force, but it was the empathic bleed that was undoing him. It was a raw, unfiltered feed of emotion, a torrent of sensation in the sterile desert of Kalen's inner world. He saw himself through Elian's eyes, a cold, calculating monster, a jailer, the soulless architect of his suffering. And he could not deny the truth in the reflection. "Stop," Kalen said, the word emerging not as a command, but as a plea. The sound of it was alien in his own ears, stripped of its usual authority. But the connection did not sever. It deepened. Elian took another step, closing the remaining distance between them. The heat radiating from his skin was intense. Kalen's every alpha instinct screamed at him, a cacophony of primal commands: dominate, claim, possess. It was a biological imperative he had suppressed and controlled with the same ruthless discipline he applied to everything else. But now, that control was failing, because the Omega before him was not just a collection of instincts. He was a consciousness, a will, and he was pushing back not with physical force, but with the sheer, undeniable weight of his own suffering. Kalen felt a sudden, violent image flash through his mind. His own father, Marcus Vance, standing in his lab, looking at a genetic sequence on a screen. The expression on his father's face was not one of scientific curiosity. It was one of covetous, fanatical hunger. He had not been seeking to understand. He had been seeking to own. The system of control, the entire corporate ideology, was not born of a desire for social harmony. It was born of one man's obsession with possessing what he could not be. The realization was a seismic shock, cracking the very foundations of Kalen's identity. He was not the preserver of order. He was the curator of a dead man's pathology. Elian reached out a trembling hand, not to strike him, not to touch him, but simply to hover in the air between them, a gesture of profound, aching vulnerability. "You built a world without feeling," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. "And now you're drowning in it." Kalen felt a sudden, sharp echo of Elian's physical state. A wave of heat, debilitating and absolute, washed through his own body. His breath hitched. For a terrifying second, he was experiencing the Omega's heat from the inside, a phantom agony that was both biological and existential. It was the pain of a body at war with itself, the torment of an identity being forcibly rewritten by instinct. And it was unbearable. He staggered back a step, his hand flying to his chest, the perfect composure he had worn his entire life shattering like glass. He was losing control. The variable was not just influencing the experiment, it was rewriting the scientist's code. He had a choice, a clear, clinical choice. There was a sedative injector in the medical kit in the other room. He could end this now. He could tranquilize the Omega, put him in stasis, and regain control of the situation. He could contain the anomaly, analyze the data from a safe distance, and solve the problem as he always had. It was the logical, rational, correct course of action. It was what his father would have done. It was what the CEO of Vance Corporation was supposed to do. But he could still feel the ghost of Elian's pain lingering in his nerves. He could still see the accusation in his eyes. To sedate him now would not be a solution. It would be an act of profound cowardice. It would be an admission that the only way he could maintain his world of order was by silencing the truth. He looked at Elian, truly looked at him, for the first time. He saw past the pheromones, past the clinical data, past the designation number. He saw a man who had been systematically broken by the very system Kalen had sworn to uphold. A man who, in the moment of his complete undoing, had found a strength Kalen had never known. The alpha who had not pressed the stop button in the elevator, who had allowed this chaos to be brought into the heart of his sanctuary, now faced a different kind of button. He could stop the feeling. He could stop the connection. He could stop the truth. He made his choice. He did not move toward the medical kit. He did not call for security. He lowered his hand and met Elian's gaze, his own eyes stripped bare of their icy defense. "I will not," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He was not speaking to Elian. He was making a vow to himself. He would not silence him. He would not run. He would stay. He would bear witness. He would let the experiment run its course, not on the Omega, but on himself. He would stand in the storm until it passed, and he would face the wreckage, whatever it might be. The fever broke like a storm at dawn. One moment, Elian was adrift in a turbulent sea of heat and sensation. The next, he was washed ashore in the quiet country of his own body. The fire in his veins had subsided to a low, warm ember. The desperate, aching need was gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He was himself again, but a self that had been unmade and remade. The silence in the room was vast, broken only by the sound of their breathing. He was lying in the nest, the soft duvet tangled around him. Kalen was sitting in the chair across the room where he had been for... Elian didn't know how long. He hadn't moved. He had simply stayed, a silent, unwavering sentinel through the final, violent peak of the heat. He looked as exhausted as Elian felt, His tie was loosened, his hair was slightly disheveled, and the glacial control in his eyes had been replaced by a raw, weary clarity. The air was still thick with the lingering scent of their mingled pheromones, but the frantic, challenging edge was gone. What remained was something softer, more complex. The scent of ozone and rain after the storm has passed. Elian slowly sat up, his limbs feeling heavy and disconnected. The anger, the rage that had fueled him had burned itself out, leaving behind a fragile, uncertain peace. He looked at Kalen, and the man who had been his jailer, his tormentor, now seemed like something else entirely, a fellow survivor. "It's over," Elian said, the words a simple statement of fact that felt monumental. Kalen nodded, his gaze unwavering. Yes. He stood and walked not to his data slate, but to the small kitchen alcove. He returned with a glass of water, holding it out to Elian. His hand was perfectly steady. Elian took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with heat or instinct. It was just skin on skin, a simple human connection. He drank, the cool water a balm to his raw throat. The silence stretched again, but it was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a space for contemplation. "My father was a zealot," Kalen said, his voice low, directed at the windowless wall as if confessing to the city beyond. He didn't believe in control. He believed in ownership. He saw Omegas not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a resource to be perfected and possessed. Project Janus wasn't about suppression. It was about cultivation. He wanted to create a more potent biological subject, one whose response would be so absolute it would guarantee a perfect, unbreakable bond. The confession landed softly in the quiet room, a truth that was both horrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. It was not Elian who was flawed. It was the system, the creator, the entire ideology. "He was looking for a key," Elian murmured, understanding. "And he wanted me to be the lock." "Yes," Kalen affirmed. He engineered a system that would hunt for him, a system that would deliver the perfect subject to his door. "I simply inherited the mechanism, without ever understanding its true purpose." He finally turned to look at Elian, his expression stripped of all pretense. "I have spent my life upholding a lie. I have enforced a system that was not designed for order, but for one man's obsession. What was done to you, it was the intended function of that system, and I was its willing administrator." The apology was not spoken, but it was there, in the quiet admission of guilt, in the profound weariness in his eyes. It was more than Elian had ever expected to receive from anyone. He had spent his life being told his biology was a problem to be solved. Kalen Vance was the first person to admit that the problem was not with him, but with the world that had tried to erase him. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak, but beneath it, something new was stirring. A fragile shoot of hope. He was no longer just a victim of the system. He was the living proof of its corruption. He was the one person who could expose the lie at the heart of their world. Kalen walked over to the terminal that displayed Elian's biometrics. With a few swift, deliberate keystrokes, he wiped the entire log. All the data from the past few days, all the evidence of Elian's humiliation, vanished. It was an act of profound trust, an erasure not of Elian, but of his own crime. Then he turned back, his face grim, his purpose clear. "You have a choice," he said, his voice regaining some of its familiar, quiet authority, but tempered now with something new. something that might have been respect. I can create a new identity for you. I can place you in a remote sector, provide you with a new suppressant, one of my own design, one that will actually work permanently. No one will ever know. You can have the quiet, neutral life you always wanted. You will be free. Elian listened, the offer hanging in the air. A quiet life, an invisible life. It was everything he had ever thought he wanted. The chance to escape, to be grey, to be nothing. It was the easy path, the safe path. But as he looked at Kalen, at the man who had been undone by his own system, he knew he could not take it. To disappear now would be to allow the lie to continue, to let his pain, his transformation, be for nothing. He had spent his life running from what he was. He was tired of running. His biology was not a curse. It was not a weakness. It was the one thing that had been strong enough to resist, to fight back, to break the unbreakable man who stood before him. It was his truth. And the other choice? Elian asked, his voice steady. Kalen's lips curved in a faint, bitter-sweet smile. It was the first time Elian had seen him do so. The other choice, he said, is that you stay. You stay here, with me. And together, we dismantle my father's legacy piece by piece from the inside. We burn it to the ground. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a destination. Elian looked around the minimalist grey room, the gilded cage that had been his personal hell, and strangely, his crucible. It was a prison, yes, but from this prison you could see the whole world. You could touch the levers of power. He thought of the millions of others, like him, swallowing their daily pill, believing in the promise of a normal, productive life, never knowing they were cogs in a dead man's obsessive machine. He could not leave them behind. He could not leave himself behind. He had been Unit 734, a functionary, a ghost, but the heat had burned away the designation, leaving only the man, Elian. He met Kalen Vance's gaze, a current of understanding passing between them. This was not about forgiveness. It was not about desire, or bonds, or any of the words their biology was supposed to dictate. It was about an alliance, a partnership forged in a crucible of trauma and revelation, a shared purpose. "I'll stay," Elian said, the words feeling more real, more true than any he had ever spoken. The faintest hint of a smile on Kalen's lips was not one of triumph, but of relief. The relief of a man who has been alone in his prison for a very long time and has just been handed a key. He gestured toward the far wall, a section of which shimmered and became transparent, revealing a breathtaking panoramic view of the city glittering below. The circuit board, the cage, theirs to command, theirs to break. They stood there for a long time, side by side, two men silhouetted against the vast, sleeping metropolis. The Alpha, who had built his life on control, and the Omega, who had been the chaos that shattered it. They were not master and subject, not captor and captive. They were co-conspirators, bound by a dangerous secret and an impossible goal. The air in the penthouse was no longer sterile. It was charged with the quiet, lingering scent of a storm that had passed, and the promise of a new one, far greater and more deliberate, that was just beginning to gather on the horizon. Elian was no longer a subject. He was a catalyst. He was not an experiment. He was the new variable that would change the entire equation. And as he looked out at the city lights, he felt not the familiar grip of fear, but the strange, terrifying, and exhilarating sensation of being truly, completely, and irrevocably awake. The quiet rebellion had begun.